SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
All right, let's take you to the nerve center of this gathering as preparations intensify for the G20 Leaders Summit in Nasrec. South Africa is already welcoming the arrival of international delegates. Security measures and logistical operations are being finalised as the country gears up to host these world leaders over the weekend. Let's continue with our build-up. Cross now to SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease, holding it down from our satellite studios in Nasrec, that's in the south of Johannesburg. And Sherwin, we're keeping a close eye on the tarmacs this morning, and Keir Starmer is still the last leader who's arrived so far. An opportunity, I suppose, for us to speak about the troika that the UK forms part of on the other side of this gathering.
Right, the tarmacs, the runways and the personalities that will be in the room over this weekend. And Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, will be part of that nucleus that will guide the G20 post-South Africa's presidency, similar to what Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, is currently doing in terms of the handover that we saw to President Ramaphosa last year. He will exit left now. South Africa will then enter the role that Brazil had for the last year. The United States will be the G20 presidency. Of course, we expect a shift in the agenda, a move away to what it views as the core mandate of the G20, away from this development focus that the last four presidencies under Indonesia, India, Brazil and South Africa have sought to engender in this process. And then, of course, the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, who also has had a number of visits to the White House, has engaged with the United States on tariffs and trade deals and peace deals, so understands a little bit about the dynamic that South Africa perhaps faces with the current administration. So certainly a momentous moment here, the first time that Keir Starmer is visiting the Republic of South Africa in his capacity as Prime Minister, but also the first time that the G20 is being held on the African continent. So an historic moment, certainly in that regard. I can tell you there is more of a buzz here than there was perhaps 2 hours ago. We are also seeing a trickling in of international media. I just got a text message from a colleague of mine that works with me at the United Nations in New York. She's from the Irish broadcasting media, and she's arrived here to cover the G20. So they're coming fast, and this room should be a buzz over the next few days, Ayanda.
Look forward to it. We certainly feel ready to start facilitating, or at least helping our viewers understand the discussions that are likely to unfold over the next little while. I know you have a guest that you're going to introduce in just a moment, but Sherwin, we shouldn't lose sight of some of these key issues that are likely to feature, right? Because South Africa did commission at least 3 major reports in the lead up to the summit. One of them is about unpacking global inequality. And I imagine these are some of the issues that you're likely to even put towards Antonio Guterres when you have that exclusive interview with him later today.
Absolutely. Equality, solidarity, sustainability, right? What Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States, criticized as a cover for diversity, equity and inclusion and issues related to climate change, which the United States, under the leadership of President Donald Trump, has disavowed. But you also then heard, those comments from South Africa's International Relations Minister, Ronald Lamola, who talked about, the difficulties about this relationship that South Africa has enjoyed with the United States, certainly over the last year, and how it is important for blocs like the G20, the majority of member states, finding a way and a means and a pathway to either move ahead, to move on with the agenda that they are deliberating on currently without the United States, and if they want to be included with them, right? But you cannot just have the United States as a spanner in the works, given the broad consensus that is probably going to emerge in that outcome document that we understand, Ayanda, is still very much under negotiation. I was talking to a contact within the Department of International Relations earlier today, and he indicated that the Sherpas worked through the night. They have still not found resolution in terms of that outcome document, and that might then, that ball might be passed on to the leaders when they, as they gather here over the next 2 days, and maybe those deliberations will get to an outcome document. But as we well know, the United States is already disassociating from that document. And so let me wrap with you now, Ayanda, and go to our guest, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Do I have the all clear?
Yeah. All the blessings.
Thanks, Ayanda.
That
So as South Africa gears up to host the G20 Leaders Summit this weekend, Diplomatic tensions are emerging on the global stage. President Cyril Ramaphosa suggested that the United States was in discussions about potentially broadening its participation in the summit. However, the White House has denied those claims, confirming that the U.S. will only participate in the handover ceremony on Sunday after citing objections to the priorities set by this G20 presidency. And as this long-standing diplomatic spat only appears to intensify, we welcome Dr. Oscar van Heerden, who's a research associate at the Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg. He joins me virtually. Dr. van Heerden, good to see you as always. Welcome.
Thanks, Sherwin, and always be here.
So, overnight we saw this he said, she said diplomatic spat again sort of get into the forefront of our narrative here at, in the coverage of our G20 processes. What do you make of this latest disagreement, disassociation, repudiation, if you will, from the United States in the vein of Carolyn Levitt that talked about President Ramaphosa's running his mouth, using quite choice language to repudiate the suggestion that the United States might engage a little bit more than was expected? I mean, what does this mean for the multilateral process here and the bilateral process enjoyed between South Africa and the United States?
Yeah, it seems it's all lost in translation, Sherwin. I think that the vociferous nature of Donald Trump when he indicated that they are boycotting this G20, no one will come to this G20, not one single official will come to the G20. Very harsh words. And then at the 11th hour, there's an engagement with the presidency and with DIRCO. And I think that it's not so much that the president was overzealous, but the president was merely trying to score some points and say that the United States have re-engaged at this 11th hour with the South African government and to have some kind of participation. Now, we then discover, ultimately, that what that engagement was towards the end of the summit. It's really just to be there to take over the gavel, so to speak, of the presidency. Because I'm sure the Trump administration wants to avoid any uncomfortableness with regards to South Africa and the United States. That has now been further complicated because we now also hear rumors that the president has indicated that he is not going to hand over to a junior official. So it's all fireworks at this 11th hour of the G20, but it makes for interesting news indeed.
Yeah, let me just press you on that, right? It's no longer a rumor. We have it on the record that the president is not going to be handing over to the charge d'affaires of the United States mission to Pretoria. What does that mean for the bilateral relationship moving forward, right? We've heard from experts that the United States is at liberty to delegate as they wish at whatever level, but the prerogative of the president is also to say, well, in terms of protocol, I don't meet with the heads of mission at the presidential level. What does that mean for the ongoing bilateral trade negotiations that are going on in the background? There's this 30% tariff on South Africa. They're trying to negotiate that down. Does this bleed into those negotiations and, possible sanctions? There's various legislation that is before Congress, in the Senate and the House of Representatives. I mean, does this all kind of get a little bit more complicated than it is today?
It is very complicated, but I do think that, what President Ramaphosa and Minister of International Relations and Cooperation has clearly decided is that they need to demonstrate leadership. They are not prepared to make this G20 hang in the balance, especially not by someone who decided not to be here. The President Ramaphosa using words like it's rather best to be inside the tent than outside the tent. And I think that they've just taken a decision that they are going to make sure that this is going to be successful. They've rallied sufficient support to make sure that there's going to be a leaders' declaration without the United States, and that they're adamant that they are not going to be dictated to by someone who is not here, who is absent. And I think that, yes, there's a lot of things that are hanging in the balance. We know that Minister Parks Tau, Steenhuisen and others are desperately trying to knock out a trade agreement. We know that there's the 30% tariffs that have been slapped. We also know that the AGOA agreement has lapsed. So all of these things hanging in the balance. And I think what President Ramaphosa is a message that he's trying to send to the Trump administration is that we must all act maturely. we need to respect each other and respect each other's sovereignty. Otherwise, if there is going to be an impression that South Africa is simply going to capitulate because of all these issues that you've mentioned, Sherwin, then they are not prepared to do so. And I think Minister Lamola in particular has made it very clear that they will not be bullied, and that if South Africa and the United States are to continue having good relations, then it must be based on shared respect, mutual respect, and so on.
All right, so we've ticked that box. Let's push that aside. Let's deal with the substance of the summit. It's Africa's first G20 summit. It's the first time the African Union will be as a fully fledged member. A very development-centric agenda here that has perhaps suggested that there is an ideological drift from what the G20 was formulated to deal with at its inception in the late 1990s, macroeconomic stability, market stability, economic growth and such, to dealing with issues like climate justice, innovation, artificial intelligence, critical minerals and the supply chains around that, development, poverty, food security and debt distress. What do you make of this moment and where the G20 goes from here?
You know, Sherwin, you would know, sitting in Washington and New York at times, that I think the Trump administration and the State Department, for some or other reason, has just completely misread the geopolitical situation internationally. I think that Europe, the European Union and individual European leaders, including the Asians, have decided and have realized that the world is moving towards multilateralism. Africa has a role to play in that, and they need to forge relations with Africa in order to take the globe forward. Interaction, integration between the global north and the global south is paramount. I think the Europeans are realizing this, especially because the Europeans themselves are beginning to realize that as a bloc, they are beginning to wane in terms of their influence and so forth. China, Brazil, India is playing a much more prominent role. And if you want to do business with them, then you need to be at the multilateral forums. And this is something that I think the Europeans have realized, they've embraced. They need to interact with the African players, with a country like South Africa. And unfortunately, the Trump administration, there is no such strategic thinking at this point in time.
What's also interesting, Dr. van Heerden, my apologies, I lost you there for a second. I thought you had stopped. But what's also interesting is that if you look at the makeup of the various G20 leaders that are going to be here, interestingly enough, a lot of them have been on the receiving end, in addition to South Africa, from sort of the rhetoric, negative rhetoric. I mean, Canada, for example, the Prime Minister Mark Carney's coming. And you remember, Donald Trump talked about, never mind the tariff issue, Canada being the 51st state of the United States, possibly. Mexico's leadership will be here. You think about the EU has also received a tongue lashing from the United States, China, and the list goes on. Does that issue create broad consensus around what an outcome document might be? The fact that perhaps we're all aligned against what has happened with the United States over the last few months?
Absolutely, Sherwin. You're hitting it on the nail. The annoyance, the irritation, the undermining, the cajoling, the forcing, the bullying. I think these are all elements that the European leaders, the other members of the G7, and of course Asia and Africa is taking into consideration, and they are saying to themselves, at some point we need to collectively send a message to the United States, to Trump and the Trump administration, that this is not how one conducts oneself within the international system. And I think it will not necessarily be expressly indicated or said by some of the leaders that is attending the G20, but I think that they are quietly rallying around President Ramaphosa for the sole purpose of sending a clear message to Trump that this is not going to go on.
So you sound very optimistic that we do get an outcome document, perhaps just minus the US.
I think the president has already begun to introduce interesting language like significant consensus and so on and so forth. There's going to be a leaders' declaration. It's going to be without the United States, possibly with some objection from Argentina, but the overwhelming majority of leaders that are attending this G Summit for the first time in Africa is going to have leaders declaration.
Dr. van Heerden, I can tell you there's significant consensus where I am that this was a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Always a pleasure.
Oscar van Heerden, Dr. Oscar van Heerden, who's a research associate at the Center of African Diplomacy and Leadership at the University of Johannesburg, in conversation with us here at our new headquarters for the next 2 days, here in the nucleus of the G20 at Nasrec, the Johannesburg Expo Center, where it's all about to take off. Ayanda, back to you in studio.
And we're certainly watching it with great anticipation. Sherwin Bryce-Pease and the rest of the team live to us there from Nasrec in the south of Johannesburg. Thanks very much indeed.